Okay, so this is going to be our Criterion A for our internal assessment. And the goal of this video is to just kind of look at and see the different elements that should be included in your Criterion A, what kind of little modifications or kind of guidance we can give to make sure that this is your best Criterion A. I'm going to look at really three things here. I'll look at Mr. B's internal assessment guide, which is great. There's this overview thing here, and also we'll look at some student exemplars a little bit later on towards the end. So this one I'm just going to give the kind of quick overview. This is a good one to kind of get started with, but we'll look for a little more depth in maybe Mr. B's guide. Section A, so in Criterion A, it's going to include three parts. It includes the scenario, the rationale for your choice, and then finally your success criteria. All really important. Success criteria is something that's going to pop up again and again throughout your work. It appears in A, B, and then in A. Well, actually, it appears in almost every section: A, B, D, and E. So it's a really important part of your work that you really need to think through. So we'll kind of work through these in order, but just kind of put that out there. That is a very important part of your work, and it will show up a lot. Okay, so we'll go through this. I think we need to start with the scenario and your client. The most important thing, I think, just to get on the right first step, is to find an authentic client. What the IB is going to look for is they're going to look for students where it looks like they created the product first and then found their client. That's not the way they should go. You should start with the client and then develop the product. So that doesn't mean like you have to wait for someone to come up to you and ask for you to write them some code. You can go and talk to them and maybe suggest some things, but they don't want you to, again, develop the whole idea and then talk to the client. You can have an idea in mind, but you should generate what this thing will look like by talking to your client. And so they're really going to look for, in this first section, they're really going to look for evidence that you've talked to a client. Again, I'm going to identify this throughout our work, but this one should have roughly about 175 to 250 words. At the bottom of each one of these sections, where there is a word count, just take a quick word count there. It'll help you later on when you add up all the individual parts of your work. So some things, before we kind of get started, I think some of you might, if you're watching this video, you might have already gotten started, but do make sure that it's something that you have talked to me, to your computer science teacher about, because we want to make sure that it's like a reasonable project. Something that you can learn how to do. So this particular, I don't see this in very many other documents, but this particular guide suggests that you have two interviews. The first interview should be where you're going to get some initial information from your client to get a picture of what you need from the software. As you do this interview, well, one, you want to have a transcript of this that you can attach in the appendix later. So it's really good if this can happen by email, would work well. If you do it by Zoom, you can include, I think you can get like the audio transcript from that later. There's a lot of different, got interrupted there. But for the interview A, I think, yeah, again, what they're looking for is the authentic. Oh, so what I was saying was to, if you make sure you have a transcript of the conversation. So that could include, hopefully it's by email or by Zoom would be great. If you do have an in-person conversation, it might be a good idea to send them an email afterwards to document that here's the things that we talked about, we discussed, this is what you want, is that correct? And get that kind of back and forth from a client right away. Because that way we can just be sure that you have the transcript there for later. Because if you don't, you really lose a lot of points in this section. Also, kind of another little hint that they give, and this is from the IB moderators, people that are grading it. Yes, include the evidence of consultation in the Criterion A, but it's also useful to include evidence in the Criterion itself. So saying things that kind of very active voice. We discussed these problems. The client said this. That really give the moderators the impression that this is a conversation that actually happened. So yes, have the transcript, but also they say this is just a good way that we can know that it's happened. Kind of going a little bit out of order, but this particular guide does suggest that maybe you could have a second interview, and that would happen after you have completed the other sections. Not all the sections, but all the other sections of Part A. You would develop the success criteria, come up with the rationale, and then you could come back to the user or the client and say, listen, here's the things that I came up with. What do you think? Is this good? Is this bad? And that would really give you a good reason to think that this is a good product, or you're going in the right path, and this will satisfy your client. So that seems like a good idea to me too. So then in the rationale for the proposed product, this is where you're going to kind of explain what kind of software you're going to use to do this, and why it makes sense in reference to your client. So one important thing here to include, or maybe to not include, is don't just say, well, I'm doing this because it's the only thing I know. probably not going to convince the moderators that this was a really well thought out project. What you can do is research a little bit about your chosen language, because there are benefits to each language. And if you're not sure what those are, you can do a little bit of research and include those in your rationale. One element of this particular guide that I really like is it gives an example of like a bad one. So like a bad example would be an alarm clock to wake you up in the morning. Okay, that's not a problem by itself, but if you design that to be something that works in like a web browser or works only on a PC, that probably doesn't make a lot of sense, because you're not going to have a PC with you all the time. If you're going to have an alarm clock, you should develop something for your phone. So you can't say, oh, well, I didn't develop my phone. I don't know how to do that. I didn't do that. So make sure that your rationale and your choice of language actually makes sense for your project. And again, or something like this, a map tool that's meant to be used on the road, but only works on your computer, doesn't work on an Android or iOS, whatever. So make sure that your choice of code or choice of, I guess, programming language matches your kind of target audience, and maybe good thing to say, like target usage. Finally, we'll get into I can't say it's the most important part about this, but it's certainly very important. It's very important that this is well thought out, because it's something you're going to reference again and again throughout your work. And this is the success criteria for your product. And these are just like, what kind of things, like what are the core functionalities of your project? What kind of things do you need to include in here in order for your project to be successful? And what kind of things, because later on when you get into, and obviously there's other videos about this, but once you get into like Criterion D, you're going to look back through this and show, hey, my product was successful because I met all these success criteria. So you really need to think deeply about, like, okay, what should my product have? What will it need to have in order for it to be successful, in order for it to do the things that I want it to do? And these can be, I think you should focus on maybe a variety of these. Some of these could be very core functionalities, should be able to save, load, or it could be maybe a little bit more advanced stuff as well in here. But just think through very thoughtfully about what you want your code to include. What should your program should include? Also, really important here, be specific. So don't just say things like, it works, it looks good, because you need to evaluate this later on. So if you do something like, it looks good, well, how are we going to possibly evaluate that later on in Criterion, say D, or also in Part E? Really hard to evaluate. You want to have very maybe specific, direct statements that you can really evaluate. Yes, this happened. No, this didn't happen. So things like, if you're going to make something that's going to save to a database, and you should be able to access it later. So say something like that. I should have my database should be savable and accessible later. And then when we get into B, we'll create a test plan for what that would specifically look like. So specific and testable. I think that hits all the major points for this. Again, the one suggestion from this particular guide is, after you finish these rationale and the success criteria, you can come back to the client and just kind of double check with them to make sure that this is something that makes sense for their project. Oh, a couple other minor things in here, just as I kind of get into these exemplars. This is going to be the last part. I think that's very crucial. If you want to, close the video after this, be my guest. But for anonymity, you don't want to include the name of your actual client. So anywhere where you put the person's name, you can just put in 2 X's to kind of cross that out. Anything that's going to identify the location, the school, they want to make these things as anonymous as possible. Just so, for example, if you have a moderator that's from your hometown, or I don't know, there's no need for this personal information to be in here. So just kind of go through that and make sure you cross that part, those things out. I mean, overall, when you look through this, so going back to this example, this will be quick, but I think that this is we're going to see that the score is pretty high, right? They got a 5, and they said they're kind of at a border of a 5 or a 4 or 5, but they do a good job, and they talk to their client specifically. They get a list of, they don't go into a crazy amount of detail. I mean, they're keeping this should be about 250 words or less, so they're not going into a crazy amount of detail, and they're really getting the requirements from their client. Their client needs to have these 3 things, or however many things are in here. They need to have these things in their project. So really focuses on the details, talks to the client. Now, when we look at the moderator's comments on this, they're going to say that, we're looking at the wrong one here. There's implicit evidence of the consultation, and the scenario is clearly described. So they feel like this part's all good. And it said the success criteria was specific and testable. So you might wonder, okay, well, why did they not get a 6 then? And they say it's a 4 or 5. And what they say here, to get into a 6, the consultation of the appendix should have been discussed and then referred to explicitly. So I think what they wanted to have in there is some direct quotes to really. It seems to me like a little bit much. If you have the appendix, you have all this, but this is what the moderators are telling us that they want. So you should have maybe some direct quotes or some, again, that kind of active voice where you're having a discussion with your client and figuring out what they need. It's a long video on that one. Didn't mean to make it that long.